Just a quick word on our firm. We're a global law firm. We're in 9 countries. We have 18 offices. 7 of them are in Canada. We're about 1,500 lawyers. And increasingly, we're involved in security, privacy, data protection, cyber-security, cryptocurrency, ICOs, blockchain, smart contracts, all of the things I think that you're probably talking about. In our blockchain and smart contract group, for example, we have 95 lawyers. Most of them are younger than I am, all interested in the change that's taking place across industry, around the world, and among the clients that we serve. I have the privilege today of introducing to you your guest speaker, Cynthia Ayers. I've just met Cindy, and I'm glad that I did. Cynthia Ayers enlisted in the Women's Army Corps in 1973, and the Army Corps was later joined with the traditional male all-volunteer force. She started to work as a Morse code operator within the then Army Security Agency, now known as the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. She spent 5 years in her first post in Germany, and then 7 years after her initial enlistment with the U.S. military, she transferred to the Army Reserve and subsequently the Air Force Reserve, all the while working as a public servant with the National Security Agency, the NSA. Cindy's intelligence community duties are vast and well known, but they include a position as an NSA representative to the Counter-Terrorism Center for the Director of Central Intelligence in the United States, where she worked extensively on the attacks involving the USS Cole and attacks, the 9/11 attacks. Secondly, she completed an 8-year assignment to the Center for Strategic Leadership as the National Security Agency's visiting professor to the U.S. Army War College. Today, Cindy's commitment to public service and her country is boundless and, quite frankly, I'm sure you'll agree with me, important. She is the deputy at the moment to the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. The focus of the task force is the national security implications of catastrophic infrastructure failure. Cindy's also a consultant with the Mission Command and Cyber Division of the Center for Strategic Leadership and Development at the U.S. Army War College. Cindy's also an author. She has published a number of articles on national security issues and is currently working on a book about bias within the federal bureaucracy in the United States, and she's co-authored academic papers on the development of cognitive agents for intelligence analysis. Cindy's also a member of several special interest groups and institutions, including the Central Pennsylvania chapter of InfraGard, which I understand is a public-private partnership with the FBI. She's a member of the Secure the Grid Coalition, which is related to the infrastructure subject I mentioned a moment ago, and she's a cyber consultant to the Strategic Concepts and Doctrine Division within the Center for Strategic Leadership at the U.S. Army War College. In her free time, she's a Rotarian and a member of the Association of the U.S. Army. She's a member of the American Legion, and she's a member of the U.S. Army War College Alumni Association. Now, on top of all of that, if that wasn't enough, Cindy is presently engaged in 2 rather important undertakings. The first is she's a member of the Executive Advisory Board of the Mackenzie Institute here in Canada. And in June of this year, she announced her candidacy for the U.S. Senate in the great state of Pennsylvania. The announcement she quite appropriately made at Gettysburg. And it's interesting to see some of the comments that have been made about Cindy's candidacy already in the U.S. media. One writer says that her expertise in defense and homeland security issues is widely respected throughout the national security community. And she's garnered the support of several high-profile members of the U.S. military complex already, and she tells me that she's expecting some more here shortly. Another writer says that Ayers' candidacy has generated a groundswell of support among people from all walks of life across the state of Pennsylvania. Cindy, welcome. Welcome to Toronto, and welcome to the Mackenzie Institute.
Thank you all so very much for the opportunity to speak with you today about cryptocurrencies. I am not an expert. I am the first to admit that on cryptocurrencies. I actually came into contact with a person who was, a gentleman by the name of Kevin Coleman, who is, I might add. He brought his expertise to us at the War College to a conference, a series of conferences on cyber sovereignty, in which he brought up the concept of virtual states. This was all new to us, and it's pretty typical of something that happens every time we have some crisis, every time something brand new comes up. We end up trying to cover our bases, trying to backtrack. And in this case, luckily, we've come across this pretty soon, pretty early in the innovation. So I'm really thankful that I was able to be here so I can learn a lot more about cryptocurrencies, and hopefully that might influence my policy in the years to come. The War College's cyber sovereignty workshops that I was just referring to have been printed up in a book, which you can get online if you're interested. But in there we have some extensive discussion about Russia, China, from some fascinating experts and virtual states. So the issue that I was talking about in regard to how the government reacts, kind of a copying behind sort of mentality, I saw this in the Counterterrorism Center many, many years ago. It was right after 9/11, when everyone all of a sudden decided we have a problem. But we had known that for many years. As a matter of fact, one of my best friends was killed in Karachi in 1995, one of the first American casualties of the war, so to speak, on terrorism. And this was nothing new to us. We had a small group of people that were working this issue for quite some time, but we really couldn't get any traction. And at some point before 9/11, it was actually discussed that they should actually do away with the centers, with the people that were working counterterrorism. Of course, thankfully, that didn't come about, and it actually grew, of course, after 9/11. Cyber warfare, same thing. We've been talking about cyber warfare for years. Everyone's known about cyber warfare for years, and yet only a few years ago, there was discussion of doing away with some of the cyber entities at military institutions. So we are, again, trying to catch up with regard to what could be done to us in cyber war. And cyber sovereignty came out of this process of catching up, as did cryptocurrencies. So with that small bit of introduction, I'll go ahead with my briefing. And as discussed, I am the deputy to the executive director of the congressionally sponsored EMP task force. It is an amazing group of people who are working almost without any kind of recognition and any kind of monetary gain, trying to fix our grid. Of course, cyber warfare plays into that. So I'm one of the advocates in terms of looking at cyber warfare with that regard. Oops. Again, this presentation was actually put together with my friend Kevin Coleman, who I was just discussing. And the disclaimer. This is my own opinion and my own work, and not that of any of the United States government organizations to which I've been affiliated with. So are terrorists actually using cryptocurrencies? This is a question that's being bandied about in open source mainly. Is it feasible that they could actually fund terrorist operations, especially major terrorist operations, using cryptocurrencies? There are many people who have an opinion on this. Some people really don't think that it's all that significant. They know that there have been several instances, a few instances that have been in open source where terrorism has been associated with cryptocurrencies, but nothing really substantial, and they don't really expect to see anything in the near future or the long-term future for that matter. Others, like this Ghost Security Group, believe that they've already seen terrorism funded by cryptocurrencies and that they have access as well as intent, and intent for the long-term future. I threw this in here because I'm I get on a bit of a soapbox when talking about risk management. In my opinion, national security issues, especially things like the grid, things like Internet of Things access, cyber warfare, there are things that we should not take risk with. And risk management, I think, has been a bit of a hindrance. I understand what risk management's all about, but it bothers me that we've gotten to the point where we've become so dependent on risk management that we can't seem to think about worst case as ever happening. And worst case, of course, does happen. The impossible, or what we think is impossible, does happen. And we absolutely have to be looking at the future. This is where the War College comes in, because we do have groups of people who are dedicated to looking at the future, the possibility of the future, what future war will look like. This is, according to Micah Zinko and the Council on Foreign Relations, this is a perfect storm. The idea that the attention that the media has been giving to cryptocurrencies, combined with improvements in terms of making cryptocurrencies anonymous, and the rise in terrorism in terms of lone wolf attacks, as well as their ability to carry out attacks across the globe. This is a perfect storm. Anonymity assists this. The use of cryptocurrencies is obviously growing, perhaps not to the extent that cyber warfare was growing before we started paying attention to it, but threat actors are definitely, they seem to be adopting this technology, especially criminals, and where there are criminals, terrorists will follow. Virtual states. Kevin Coleman introduced me to virtual states. Virtual states are groups of people with like-minded agendas coming together in the digital world for specific kind of lifetime opportunities in terms of living together almost. It's like having a nation state existing in cyberspace, and to the extent where you could actually live there mentally, if not physically, albeit not physically. Oops. Oh, thank you. So what we're seeing right now in terms of virtual states are probably what you would expect. We're seeing a little bit from terrorist groups, we're seeing a little bit from nation states, some of the proxies, that kind of thing. And many of them are looking at funding their activities with virtual currencies. These threat actors on one side, just to reiterate a little bit, if you're thinking of hacktivists like Anonymous, or criminal elements, in my mind, a criminal element like Antifa, or even activists like Occupy Wall Street, these could all be virtual states. And of course, the dark web. The dark web is fueled by cryptocurrencies, and that is where criminals, terrorists, and just about anybody else you can think of who have nefarious ideas are residing at the moment. I understand we'll have a presentation on that a little bit later. So the rise of the dark web, obviously, we've seen a lot of these functions going on the dark web, and many others that are probably much too horrific to describe. And again, the dark web is an excellent place for anonymity and an excellent place to use cryptocurrencies. This particular project has described the relationship between organized crime and terrorism as being symbiotic. And I have to agree with that. We've seen that across the board for many, many, many years, where you see weapons smugglers, human smugglers, just about any kind of criminal elements you can think of, passport, ID theft, people who are fraudulently selling them, they are always somehow connected with terrorist groups. At the moment, as of last night, there were 1,283 cryptocurrencies. Now, I realize that all of these aren't actual currencies in the way that we have been speaking about, like Bitcoin. But if you think about it, there are 229 countries, 177 national currencies, currently in use, 1,283 currencies, regardless of how many of those are actually just game tokens or other kinds of things. That's a lot of currencies. How many of those might be already connected with virtual states? So you've already heard the basics. You've heard about wallets and about how thieves, state-sponsored terrorists, can actually gain entrance into these wallets and pull money out of them. This isn't, as I understand it, a very big issue at the moment, but from what I understand, it has happened. And you've heard about blockchain. Oh, and I might add, blockchain can be used by terrorists for many other types of functions also. So you've heard about how to gather cryptocurrencies through mining, where the miner receives a fraction of the coin. And in order to do that, you usually have to have some software and some hardware, extensive amount of software and hardware, usually up to about $5,000 worth of stuff in order to do this. Although people like Kim Jong-un and his cyber operatives have been able to bypass the costs by hijacking or cryptojacking other people's computers. There are theft, instances of theft via hacking and ransomware, which you already heard about. And there's actually a case of a 30-year-old young man who was picked up by the police in Philadelphia of all places. He had stolen several laptops, and that's what the police were looking at. So they came into his home to pick up these laptops, and lo and behold, he had a list of passwords for Bitcoin. He had lists of names and all kinds of access bits and pieces for other people's Bitcoin. According to this guy, he had accumulated between 40 and 50, I believe it was, yeah, 40 and 50 million dollars in Bitcoin at 30 years old. What a gig, huh? Oh, and then there's fraud, of course, which has already been discussed also. It's very difficult to investigate and very difficult to prosecute. So the problem is inherent in that the same things that attract us to Bitcoin as users, as people who want to use it for legitimate purposes, that's exactly what attracts terrorists and criminals to Bitcoin to use in their other nefarious operations. Anonymity, as again previously stated, not all of cryptocurrencies are created equally in terms of anonymity, excuse me, but at least these 5 have several points of privacy, security. They're said to be better than some of the others. So are terrorists going high tech? Well, there are drawbacks to this. If they are going high tech, or if they want to go high tech, the value is unpredictable. I believe someone said earlier that you put some money into an account and you go back and draw it out and it's gone down very quickly instead of up. On the other hand, I believe the cost of Bitcoin now is phenomenal. I think it's only going up. So it really depends on which kind of coin you're picking, I believe. It's not necessarily impossible to track, but to a certain degree it is anonymous at this point in time. And from what I've been reading, most of the people who work counterterrorism or who have an opinion on counterterrorism issues with regard to cryptocurrencies believe that the only way that they would be using this is for lone wolf attacks, because the cryptocurrencies would not allow for large sums to be cashed in to be used for major operations. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Of course, the benefits, again, anonymity, speed. Speed is a huge benefit for them, global reach, of course, and the ease of use to those who understand it. Now, obviously, a lot of terrorists have no clue what they're doing with regard to cyberspace or with cryptocurrencies, but that doesn't mean that they're all Luddites. And some of them are actually very good and much better than many of us are in the federal government. This is a former CIA counterterrorism analyst. He himself, he's a bit of two minds. He doesn't believe that terrorism will show itself in the cryptocurrency realm to a large degree, but he also says criminals are using it, and they will use it. And the problem is, how do governments deal with something that government can't control? So he stated that the real threat is in the nexus between the point where terrorists and criminals' activities merge. And this is probably a pretty good description of that nexus. There's $650 billion worth of illicit goods, guns, weapons, natural resources, all kinds of things that are conducted through the economy as a business transaction, if you will. And cryptocurrencies allow traffickers to do that with little fear or without fear of any legal repercussions as a result. And these are, again, the same activities used by terrorists. So how are terrorists using these cryptocurrencies? In 2014, there was an ISIS-associated blog which explained all of the details as to how ISIS could fund their activities using cryptocurrencies, by Bitcoin specifically. 2015, Ghost Security Group claimed to have found several cryptocurrency accounts used by ISIS, and at least one of the accounts had $3 million in it. Also in 2015, ISIS allegedly posted a Bitcoin address on the dark web, asking for donations. So it was pretty blatant at that point, albeit only to those who worked the dark web. But then a Virginia teenager was arrested, also trying to send instructions on how friends of his, how others could donate to ISIS using cryptocurrencies and social media. 2016, the Sure Council solicited Bitcoin to purchase weapons. This is probably not a really big cache of weapons. From the sound of it, it was relatively low grade, but still, they're using it. And in 2017, in Indonesia, Islamic militants funded terrorist activities using Bitcoin. I didn't find out exactly what those activities were. There is a point where what I'm saying in terms of open source kind of overlaps what I know in the classified realm, so I don't really want to get into that anyway. Oops. Am I doing that? Okay. Cryptocurrencies with regard to U.S. sanctions bill. A U.S. sanctions bill is being proffered, and this happened in August. I put the date up here for a reason. To include combating terrorism, financing of terrorism and related forms of illicit finance in a sanctions act. The bill calls for research into cryptocurrency usage, and that particular report is due next year. But Putin is obviously also a bit worried about this. Now, the reason I think that this came about in our own bill was because Kim Jong-un, North Korean operatives, were noted specifically with the WannaCry ransomware attacks in June. And then later, as it came out in open source, they were stealing Bitcoin by various means, cryptojacking, and mining their own cryptocurrencies in order to evade sanctions. So I believe this is why the Sanctions Act included cryptocurrencies. There's, again, a lot of discussion on the degree of use by terrorists, and you've got Yes, they do use it. Yeah, they might be using it, but it's on a small scale, and no, they're not going to use it, not on a large scale at all. And many of the people who say they're not going to use it rely on past history with the Hawala networks. Hawala networks were the way that terrorists usually, and still do to a large degree, fund their terrorist operations with anonymity. Unfortunately, there are human frailties, so it's not totally without its flaws. It does offer a degree of trust, but again, there are humans involved, so whether or not the trust can be complete or not is another story. It does offer a certain amount of convenience, but cryptocurrencies offer speed and convenience over that. The Holy Land Foundation trial, this was almost unique in that it showed the world to the degree that terrorists have been using banks in order to transfer money and fund their operations. This was not too long after 9/11 that they picked up the people who were associated with the Holy Land Foundation. They were being funded through this charity, which was based in Texas. I am very interested in the Holy Land Foundation trial mainly because it exposed the degree to which Iran was implicated, actually, in al-Qaeda operations. They were supporting al-Qaeda for quite some time. And that really didn't make it to the press. Unless you look at the Holy Land Foundation trial documents extensively, you wouldn't have known that. But it showed us to what extent you can find information that you cannot necessarily find via other means through looking at the banking transactions of the people who are funding terrorist activities. Terrorists have also used other ways of funding their activities, such as guns for drugs. This usually, up to recently anyway, had been happening between the Middle East and South America. South American terrorists would send weapons to get drugs and vice versa. It was an interesting case to work anyway. In other areas, such as in the Philippines, the Abu Sayyaf group is a good example of this. They actually kidnap people for ransom and, of course, fund terrorist activities via other means across the world because of the ransom that they receive from the terrorists, from the people that they kidnap. So recent improvements to cryptocurrency anonymity may be the point at which terrorists are encouraged to gain more of an entry into cryptocurrency usage. And these are just a few of the examples of things that have come up recently. Since I'm not a technical expert on these things, I will allow someone else to explain it. But these supposedly allow almost complete anonymity, virtually untraceable transactions, and this might be the point at which terrorists start to use them. You probably have seen our ex-FBI chief, James Comey there. He, in a testimony before he departed his position, he talked about criminals going dark. And you could say the same about terrorists. They have gone dark. They've gone to the dark web. They've gone to all kinds of different paths that are keeping us from following them on a regular basis. But going dark, and this includes using cryptocurrencies, has essentially left the FBI in the lurch in many ways, trying to track the terrorist groups that they're assigned with. This precipitated the FBI's budget in 2018. It includes budgeting for support to crack down on the criminal usage of cryptocurrencies. And I'm hoping that terrorist usage will follow, since there really is no stovepipe difference between the two. European police, Interpol, they have announced the establishment of a joint anti-money laundering unit specifically for digital currencies. Australia has blamed Bitcoin on a massive increase in criminal activity over the past several years. And they are working legislatively to stop the movement of money from criminals, or to criminals and to terrorists. European Union, again, Bitcoin, according to the European Union, accounted for approximately 40% of all identified criminal-to-criminal payments. It's amazing, 40%. That is a huge, huge number. And they, again, are working on trying to establish different kinds of legislation and penalties. So you've heard what cryptocurrencies are. And so I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. But they are value, and value in terms of value for use as money laundering and financing terrorism. And that really is the most important aspect in my mind. These are generic pieces of advice that I picked up from several of the articles that I read. And for the most part, it's kind of the same old. What we found, what we heard after people started getting more and more interested in terrorism, we need more accountability, we need more tracking, we need more reporting, and we need more coordination. This is kind of the same stuff. It's, while it's all good, I think there's got to be something more, and perhaps that's what we will learn as we go further down the path. We were discussing the value of Bitcoin earlier, which is now over $9,000, I believe I heard. And yet, the U.S. bill, Senate bill, that was recently introduced has decided to require travelers to declare digital currencies if the amount is $10,000 or more. So if you have more than one Bitcoin, you're kind of in trouble there. You've got to declare it. As I understand it, there's a lot of paperwork that goes along with that. I'm not sure. I've not ever had $10,000 to cross a border with, so I really don't know, but I'm going to have to look into that more. This is my opinion. Terrorists are early adopters, and they will and can adapt to any and all environments. They do it quickly. They do it better than any government agency that we have currently working on counterterrorism efforts. Government is hindered by regulation, political correctness, you name it. We have an unfortunate amount of hindrances, of obstacles in our path that terrorists do not have, and neither do the criminals. They will, in my opinion, terrorists will use cryptocurrency to finance their activities, and they will probably use them for major events. If the amount of the transactions are a problem, they will figure out a way to get around it. But I believe this is probably one of the ways that they will move into very quickly, because all of the other ways that they have been financing up to this point have been known and understood by counterterrorism officials, and they're being closely watched, and they know it. Cryptocurrencies are very difficult to watch. Therefore, that's where they'll go. Unfortunately, we're continually surrounded by naysayers, people who really don't think that it's not possible. If you've not seen it before, if it hasn't happened before, it's just not possible. It's not going to come up. It's not a problem. We give these naysayers primary consideration over and above what we know in our hearts to be true many times. And we must instead see the potential, look at the possibility of worst case, look at the scenarios that are possible, and what could possibly bring us down. I'm not saying that cryptocurrencies are a huge national security threat in terms of killing us all off, but it's possible it could be a useful support tool for doing just that. I imagine most of you know what a black swan event is, but just in case some of you don't, I'll go over it very quickly. It's a surprise with major effects and almost always rationalized by hindsight. A vicious black swan event is the fact that it's unexpected makes it all the more likely to happen. It gives it the conditions. It creates the conditions for it to occur, a vicious black swan event. To a large degree, 9/11 was a vicious black swan event. Now, we at the War College look at things like what the next war will be like. And generally, this conversation falls into the realm of the first battle of the next war syndrome. We end up talking about what the first battle of the next war will look like. Most of the time, you end up thinking about it in terms of what the last battle of the most recent war was like. And of course, if you're looking at war, we really don't have a last battle that had anything to do with cryptocurrencies. So what we're going to be looking at, if people continue along those lines of looking at only the last battle, we're not going to have any consideration of cryptocurrencies whatsoever. It's not going to be there. And I've seen that over and over and over again in terms of terrorism, cyber warfare. It always happens. No matter how much you believe you're putting your mind and your brain into function to try to get into a scenario where you've got a future occurrence, it always seems to go back to that last battle of the most recent war. So 9/11 was an attack against DIME. This is the military terminology. DIME is diplomatic, information, intelligence, military, and economic aspects. 9/11 hurt us significantly, especially in the economic realm. It didn't take us down, and they're still trying, obviously. The the strategic center of gravity is something that all people, be they adversaries or our own people, our own military senior leaders look at with regard to going against an enemy. And what you're looking at is something that is, it's a person, place, or thing, or perhaps even something else that's representative of the center of gravity, which is preferably designed to take us down instantaneously and long term. Instantaneously and long term. It's cutting off the head of the snake. There are many, many other types of words you could use for it, but essentially it's something to take the adversary out from the start. Center of gravity has been described by Dr. Strange, and that is Dr. Strange, by the way, not Dr. Strangelove. Agents and or sources of moral and or physical strength, power, and resistance. The hub of all power and movement on which everything depends. The economy and currency markets are centers of gravity. A few years ago, our senior leaders, as I said earlier, didn't even think that cyber warfare was going to be a significant player in the future wars. Cyber warfare was not considered anything that could be a viable option for an adversary to do a first strike and take us down with any significant loss whatsoever. But as you've probably read about in Ukrainian, over the past 2 years, the Ukrainian attacks, actually the Russian attacks against Ukraine's power grids, twice in a row, in December 2015 and December 2016, the Russians attacked the power grid. And nobody thought it was possible to take a power grid down via cyber attack up to that point. This is the kind of thing we have got to develop scenarios about across the board with all technologies, including cryptocurrencies. As you can see here, digital first strike is no longer theoretical. What else will no longer be theoretical? What's next? How will cryptocurrencies weigh into this mix? And again, we have got to start foreseeing the unforeseen, looking at worst case. Worst case does happen, and we know that. We know 9/11, the Holocaust, Rwanda, Burundi, time and time again, we're caught unaware, and we have got to stop the kind of mentality, the stovepiped mentality that we've grown up with, and we've got to start looking at things that are possible, especially with the high-tech world that we're living in today. Again, I thank you very much. This has been a very enlightening morning, and I hope to learn much, much more in the afternoon sessions. I greatly appreciate the opportunity and the chance to be here.